Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Austin Revel. I'm owner and CEO of 2F by C Tactical, an FFL dealer located in New Prague, Minnesota. You can check us out online at www.2fbyctactical.com. And I appreciate everyone tuning in to this historical look of firearm law passed by Congress federally in the United States. Now we're coming to the end of our series, and I know it's been a few weeks. I do apologize. It's been a little crazy around around the shop as we got our hands on a lot of different things going on these days. But we are at the end almost. We only have one more episode left of federally passed gun control laws in the United States, and that would be the Bipartisan Savers Community Act. That's the next episode. Today, we're breaking down the Assault Weapons Ban of 1994. Now, this wasn't a standalone bill. This was a part of the crime bill passed by Bill Clinton in 1994, and it did sunset after 10 years. 2004, it was not renewed by then President George W. Bush and the Congress, and it was allowed to expire. Now, after this series, we're probably going to start getting into the historical pieces we have behind me, and some you can't see, and we'll just talk about what they are, what they bring to the table, and the different historical uses, whether it be civilian or it would be military. Around the world. Now, and we may even bring some stuff from the shop too. We do get some pretty cool things to come through time to time. Now, with that being said, diving into the Assault Weapons Ban of 1994, and some of these themes you're going to hear in this, you'll recognize, because there are 8 states and a territory, if you include Washington, D.C., that have some form of an assault weapons ban passed at the state level. And it does mirror the language of the federal ban of 1994. So some of this stuff, for those of you who keep up or geek out on this kind of stuff, will understand it and be like, oh, I recognize that. So with that being said, we're going to hop into our DeLorean. We got only one more trip after this one, so we're going to throw a beer can and a banana peel into Mr. Fusion. Go back not quite so far this time, 1994, just a little over 30 years, or a little less than 30 years ago, I guess I should say. And we're going to look at the first time Congress has banned for civilian possession types of weapons for sale. Now, we look at, say, the National Firearms Act, like, right, our first episode, we broke that down into 2 parts. Well, the NFA doesn't ban weapons. In fact, the Attorney General at the time said they couldn't do that. It does put a prohibitive tax, especially for the time, of $200 on firearms in the categories in which it regulates. But it doesn't ban for civilian sale any type of gun, as long as you follow that NFA process for the weapons that affects. When we move forward to 1968, again, the Gun Control Act doesn't ban anything. It does set up the FFL regulations and the 4473s that would come later and all that kind of stuff. The process of buying guns that are now heavily regulated items as opposed to just normal over-the-counter stuff. I guess you can make the argument that it does narrow what can be imported in the United States, so it can ban imports to a degree, but it doesn't ban categories of firearms. Even the Firearm Owners Protection Act, I mean, that's the first time we hear of a ban, and it's the ban of the addition to the registry of machine guns post May 19th, 1986. That is true. But broad swaths of guns haven't ever been banned on the in the United States under any law till 1994, which really does put things in perspective, right? We hear a lot about this is common sense, historical traditions, there's a history of this. And that is simply just not true. Now, we try to stay out of the politics of this. I have my own personal opinions. And maybe some days we'll do some videos on the personal politics that get into the gun control arguments. But I would say that when you look at this particular thing, it's a very new wave idea that is being touted out again, and they're using 1994 as kind of a historical analog to argue for this, and that just simply wasn't that long ago, and that really does put in perspective how recent a lot of this stuff is. So let's dive into this. So what is the Federal Assault Weapons Ban? Well, it was brought into existence by Senator Dianne Feinstein. Now, Feinstein has a pretty sordid history with firearms. She was actually an NRA ranked member at one point, all the way back in the 70s, when she was mayor of San Francisco. Now, we've come a long way from that time, though. Now we're in 1994. Now, there was some attempts on her life in the late 70s with some radical left-wing movements in the United States that targeted her, militia groups that did target her, and some bombings and stuff. So that kind of changed her views on firearms. And now she's to the point where she openly said during the oral arguments of this particular bill that if she could ban all firearms from everyone in the United States, she would do it. But she didn't think she could do that, so therefore she's only going after the ones that she deems most unusually and dangerous. So what did they do? Well, they built this bill that basically bans roughly 200 firearms by name. Some of these makes models you will recognize. You know, the Uzi, the AR-15, AK-47 and variants. Maybe even like you'll hear about, like, say, the SPAS 12. Things like that. Things that you and I would know as everyday guns. Now, these aren't NFA items. Let's make that clear. What we're talking about is just regular everyday run-of-the-mill guns. Semi-automatic in nature. They would have a feature test that we'll get into in a second, and then they would also have the make and model ban as well. And we won't read off all 200 models, but you get the idea with, like, the ARs, the AKs, and maybe like the Tech 9 and the Uzi, so submachine gun variants. But I want to use that term very lightly here because we're not talking about actual full auto submachine guns. We're talking about semi-auto cousins, if you will, of the full auto machine gun parts. So this was part of the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Act, enacted as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. So what does that mean? So this was a subsection of that Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. It's quite the mouthful there. And so we're just focusing on the assault weapons ban. We're not focusing on the broader picture of that bill. Now, with that being said, Joe Biden, our current president here in 2023, was a big sponsor of this bill. Really, really pushing. In fact, you hear him today speaking about the assault weapons ban in glowing terms, saying that we should bring it back. Now, one of the things about this bill was it did actually enact some exemptions to it. So it did have a why grandfather clause, basically saying that any weapons that were in existence in civilian hands prior to this going into effect, you got to keep. They could be bought and resold. They just have to be these pre-ban guns. Some of us who shop online will see pre-ban AR-15. That's just mean pre-assault weapons ban AR-15. That's what they're talking about. And they obviously, and this always is an exception in every state that has an assault weapons ban, which is simply that if you're law enforcement or government entity, you are exempt from any and all gun control. That is just typically how that works. That was another exemption. It did actually include an exemption of 650 firearms by name. So what does that mean? Well, it would include the Ruger Mini 14, for instance. Now, this was not the folding stock model, the solid stock. If it had the side folding stock, then of course that was an assault weapon. You couldn't have it. So if you just had the standard Ruger Mini 14 with the full wooden stock, full wooden stock, very similar like you see on this, then you're fine. So we are talking about features here. They would also do the M1 carbine, the Ivory Johnson M1 carbine, and the reason why largely this was done was, you got to remember, back in, we discussed this in the 68 Gun Control Act episode, is that, well, the federal government just sold a bunch of those back in 1968, so they had proliferated those themselves into the civilian world, so therefore they exempted those, didn't want to run into any issues there. So these are the type of weapons that you saw exempt, and of course there was also the features list weapons, if we want to use it: bolt action rifles, pump action shotguns, rifles, semi-automatic rifles that didn't take a detachable magazine or one of the offending features. So, and the tubular magazines, I should say that, we're talking about the Winchester, repeating rifles, lever action, that kind of stuff. If it had a tube, that was an exempt. So this act also, when we get into what it banned, like I said, it banned like over 200 specific types, plus the feature list. So features were, you couldn't have more than one of these items. If it could accept a magazine, a detachable magazine, it couldn't have a pistol grip and that. It couldn't have a barrel shroud and that. It couldn't have a bayonet lug and that. It couldn't have an adjustable stock and that, right? So it had to be only one of those items. The other thing that it did do is it banned magazines over 10 rounds. So some of these you will see still floating around out there, and they're not illegal to sell anymore because this has expired. This had a 10-year expiration date. It was up for renewal in 2004, and George W. Bush decided not to renew it. You'll see sometimes these old magazines that have stamped on them, for law enforcement use only. Well, this was an assault weapons ban produced magazine saying that this is over 10 rounds, cannot be bought and sold by anyone other than law enforcement. Now, this was done kind of on the heels of H.W. Bush, who had banned guns from imports just a few years earlier in 1989. But again, no, that was done on the import side, which the executive branch has broad swaths of control over. When it comes to this particular ban, what did it actually do? In terms of gun violence, right? This was part of the violent crime bill. It was meant to cut down gun violence. And the truth is, it actually did nothing. Even Congress and the Department of Justice did an investigation in 2003, getting ready for the renewal of the assault weapons ban in 2004 to see if it had any statistical effect, and they found out it was statistically negligible at best, and most likely it didn't have an effect at all. Now you got to remember, like the Columbine massacre, Tech 9, that was on the banned list. This happened in 1998, so it happened in the middle of the assault weapons ban. So it turns out that it actually didn't have an effect on mass shootings, and mostly it's because the average, quote-unquote, not my words, taken the feature list from this text, assault weapon, was not actually used in crime all that often. We're talking handguns mostly. We're not usually talking about ARs or AKs or anything like that. The news does sensationalize their use, but the reality is it's very, very, very small when it's actually used. So when it came up for renewal, and the presidency had flipped, the Democrat Bill Clinton, Republican George W. Bush, it was decided we're not going to renew this. And the country was largely actually unified on this. There were some Democrats, like Dianne Feinstein and all, that pushed it. But the reality was it was actually bipartisan not to renew this. Even though Congress was firmly in the Republicans' hands at this particular time. 9/11 that happened, we had Iraq and Afghanistan going on. Things were just, domestically, things were actually going fairly good despite the terrorist attacks. So it wasn't really looking internally when it came. So we if you want, for us gun owners, we kind of lucked out on that. Now we have recalls, excuse me, I can't speak there. We are hearing calls to renew this ban or bring it back, minus, of course, the 10-year sunset clause, because they don't want to do this again. But that's what we see here for the assault weapons ban. So just breaking it down. Now, I know this video isn't very long, but the reality is this was just a single firearm ban, or a category ban, if I will, of firearms featuring certain cosmetic attachments is really all it was. It wasn't based on function, caliber, or anything like that. Next week, or I shouldn't say next week, next video, hopefully next week, but we'll see how the week goes. We'll close this out with the Bipartisan Safer Community Act. If you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe. I hope to see you there. Thank you.